Very welcome back to Stora Essingen and the conference 100 Years of Social Pensions in Sweden, Global Poverty Challenges and Experiences of Social Protection. And we had a marvelous day yesterday, at least I think so, with so many interesting speeches and not least interesting questions from the floor. And I'm most certainly looking forward to another day of excellence here at this conference. And I hope you enjoyed last evening's fairy tale adventures at Junibacken. We will start, just like we did yesterday, with a little show, some voices from the past to remind us that these questions with rich and poor, rights and deservance, charity and dignity, probably are as old as mankind, really. In 1906, there was another conference here in Stockholm, and I'm telling you, new friends, this. But it was a big conference on the theme poverty, charity, social security, and insurance. 3,000 persons came to this conference. Social workers, priests, nurses, doctors, politicians, both on the local and national level. We heard some of those voices yesterday, and today we have collected a few other voices on a slightly different theme, that is human rights and citizen rights. But exactly as yesterday, we give the first word to the Minister and the Minister of Agriculture, Mr. Alfred Pettersson. So please, Mr. Pettersson and all of you others in the conference, please take the stand. The floor is yours. Take the stand.
Fattigvårdsfrågan är ingen ny fråga i samhället. Det har alltid frågats vilka är berättigade till fattigvård. Vem ska besörja den? Varje tids åskådning färgar svaren. Nya tider fordrar nya svar. Civilisationens framsteg, det växande erkännandet av människovärdet, kräva av samhället en varmare och rikare hand i arbetet för fattigvårdsfrågans lösning. Tack för ordet.
Herr G.H. von Kock.
Fattigvårdens väsentliga uppgift är att motarbeta fattigdomen såsom ett samhällsont och förhindra att fattigdom uppstår. Slutligen bör vi besinna att denna fattigvård tar hand om vårt värderikaste kapital, det uppväxande släktet.
Riksdagsman, borgmästare Jakob Pettersson. Mayor Jakob Pettersson.
Ärade ledamöter. I fråga om pensionering av behövande så har Danmark varit föregångslandet. Denna form är överlägsen fattigvården, men den har likväl sina fel. Den motverkar folkets uppfostran till arbetsamhet och sparsamhet. Och man klagar i Danmark över att lagen bidragit till att slappa förhållandet mellan föräldrar och barn, som numera ej anser sig ens moraliskt förpliktigade att draga försorg om föräldrarna på deras ålderdom. Det är problematiskt.
Kyrkoherde A. Westergren. Reverend A. Westergren.
De fattiga har också sitt ansvar. De måste dela sin del av samfundets bördor. Det ligger inte i samhällets väl att de fattiga vänjer sig vid alltför frikostiga förmåner utan egen insats. De bör också genom god vandel och artigt skick själva förtjäna sitt bistånd.
Doktor Carolina Widerström, medical doctor Carolina Widerström, the first female doctor in Sweden, actually.
Tack. Vilka kvinnor bliva prostituerade? Ingen är en dålig flicka från början. Hur några stammar från förbrytare är sexuellt utsvävande eller lättjefulla. Åter andra är både hedliga, ärbara och arbetsamma. Men det råkar en vacker dag stå övergivna och utblottade med ett illegitimt barn att försörja. Arbete står ingenstans att finna, misskund ej heller. Gatan kan ju ge livsuppehälle åt både en och två. Framförallt ligger orsaken i kvinnornas låga löner. Arbetsgivare som betalar svältlöner och med dem hela den allmänhet som underbetalar kvinnligt arbete har således en stor direkt skuld till prostitutionens utbredning.
Det var ord och inga visor. Pastor H. Boklund, Lund. Pastor Boklund från Lund.
Jag skulle kunna tala om en 10-årig flicka. När hon fick höra talas om att lärarinnan inte kunde behålla henne utan att hon skulle auktioneras bort. Och det till råga på allt till en rå celle i församlingen som har blivit beskylld för att ha piskat ihjäl ett barn. Flickan kastade sig på knä, slog armarna om lärarinnan och ropade: sälj mig inte, sälj mig inte. Jag ska göra vad ni vill och jag ska äta så lite, så lite. Jag säger bara, den tid ska komma och må den komma ganska snart när vi med blygsel ser tillbaka på sådana fattigaktioner som förekommer idag 1906.
Herr A. Norman, Sigtuna.
Man får inte låta samhället duka under för de fattiga. Man behöver bara hänvisa till den gamla erfarenheten att det är samma familjer som släktled efter släktled faller fattigvården till last. Att tillåta äktenskap mellan fnoskiga fattighjon, personer med förbrytaranlag eller ärftliga sjukdomar, som måste betraktas som i hög grad samhällsskadligt. Det som erhållit fattigvård under de senaste 5 åren borde, som i Danmark, vara tvungna att inhämta fattigvårdsstyrelsens godkännande för äktenskapsingående.
Dr. Carolina Widerström. Medical Doctor Carolina Widerström again.
Kvinnorna måste få yrkesutbildning för att kunna göra sig förtjänta av samma lön som män. Trångboddheten måste bekämpas och likaså spritmissbruket. Den ogifta modern måste få stöd och barnafadern genom lagstiftning förmås att göra sin skyldighet ekonomiskt. Detta är kvinnans rätt.
Fattigvårdskommitténs ordförande herr G.H. von Kock.
Både fattigvård och folkförsäkring har sitt berättigande. Men medan den understödde erhåller en gåva av samhället som berövar honom åtskilliga rättigheter, tager den försäkrade sin pension utan obehag. Det är hans rättighet att göra det. Och han lider inte som helst avbräck av sin medborgerliga ställning.
Thank you, Mr. Kock, and all of you. this morning's first modern speaker, who is no less than Magdalena Sepúlveda Carmona. She is UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights. Welcome, Magdalena. You are also a visiting fellow at the United Nations Research Institute for Social Development. You are a lawyer who holds a PhD in international human rights law from Utrecht University in Netherlands. And the floor is yours, Magdalena, and after that we invite a three-man and woman panel to keep up your questions and also welcome the floor in a common discussion here. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good morning. It is a pleasure for me to be here. I would like to congratulate the organizers for this excellent initiative celebrating a century of social pension in Sweden. While this country has long been a leader in social protection, I have been happy to see that in recent years increasing recognition that comprehensive social protection is not just something for the Nordic countries, but a key tool in ensuring sufficient income and a minimal level of enjoyment of economic, social and cultural rights, which should be shared by everyone around the world. As we heard from the speakers yesterday, social protection has gained predominance and political support in development and poverty reduction discourse over the past few years in an almost unprecedented manner. As Professor Varientos and Holmes have noted, social protection can be viewed as a quiet revolution. I'm convinced that the current political momentum around social protection provides a unique opportunity to reinvigorate the development agenda, hopefully by including through commitments by states on social protection in the evolving post-2015 development agenda. However, at the same time, I believe that there remains a pressing need to mainstream human rights in the concept of social protection to ensure its full potential and impact on poverty reduction and development is realized. The rhetoric of deserving versus undeserving poor is in fact still very prevalent in many countries, and therefore we still need to make the case that everyone deserves and indeed is entitled to social protection, social security as a basic human rights. The duty to implement and expand social protection system to cover everyone in need of protection flows directly from several international human rights treaties and regional human rights treaties, as well as conventions of the ILO. To be sure, human rights standards do not provide answers to all the challenges that policymakers face when designing social protection programs. They do, however, impose legally binding obligations governing the discretion of the states. Those obligations not only require the state to put social protection systems in place, but also guide the manner in which they do so, obligations related to the process in which they are established, and the intended result of such system, obligations related to the outcomes. Moreover, rights-based social protection measures help states to fulfill several human rights obligations, including ensuring the enjoyment of the right to the highest attainable standard of health, the right to food, the right to education, and many other rights. While there is a strong evidence that social protection system can assist states in fulfilling their obligation under national, regional, and international human rights law to ensure the enjoyment of at least minimal essential level of economic, social, and cultural rights, nonetheless, If social protection systems are not rights-based, including being gender sensitive, they could create unintended impacts, increase vulnerabilities and social exclusion of some potential beneficiaries, and negatively affect gender relations. Policymakers and development practitioners, therefore, need to become more attuned to the direct and indirect impacts of social protection programs on human rights, both positive and negative. There's been important development in this regard, from the pioneer work of the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, General Comment 19 on the right to social security, to last year ILO Recommendation 202 on social protection floor, which, not mentioning human rights in the substantive questions, substantive sections of the recommendation, nevertheless as an important rights-based approach. Still, considering the extensive human rights obligations that states have by virtue of multiple human rights treaties, and given that all UN agencies have committed to mainstream human rights throughout the UN system, the lack of a systemic discussion of social protection from a human rights perspective is extremely concerning. Accordingly, over the past 5 years, together with several partners, I have focused my work as UN independent expert on extreme poverty and human rights on further developing and promoting a rights-based approach for social protection, identifying best practices and disseminating lessons learned. Today, I will present some reflections on the persistence of the deserving and deserving poor ideology and how it is influencing policymakers has a negative impact on the design of social protection system and on human rights. I will propose that a rights-based approach to social protection system is not only a legal obligation, but an important tool to ensure that this social protection system gather the political support that they deserve and that they respect the rights and dignity of all recipients. So I'm going to talk today how we should move from the undeserving poor to treat people as right holders. I would like to discuss how prejudices and a stigma against the poor are major barriers to effectively tackling poverty and achieving the full potential of social protection. When such prejudices inform social protection policies, these policies tend to deny the dignity and the autonomy of the poor, fail to recognize that they should enjoy their rights and freedom in equal manner with the rest of the population, and overlook all the obstacles that people living in poverty face to overcome their situation and lift themselves out of poverty. As part of my work, I meet and interact with people living in poverty as well as state officials and civil society groups. In this role, it has become increasingly and shockingly clear to me that one of the main obstacles in the fight against poverty is the deep-seated stigma and prejudice against the poor that unfortunately seems to be universally widespread among those who are better off in society. And this managed to find its way into government policy and programming intentionally or unintentionally. In different countries, the common prejudices that I hear stereotype persons living in poverty as lazy, irresponsible, indifferent to their children's health and education, dishonest, undeserving, and even criminals. Poverty is considered a personal failing, the result of not taking responsibility for one's own life. Those living in poverty are considered the author of their own misfortune, who can remedy their situation by simply trying harder or working harder. Such a vision of poverty that has obvious implication for arguments around social protection. This negative prejudice against the poor happens in developed and in developing countries. This week, at the beginning of the week, we were reminded of this negative prejudice, for example, in the UK, that it was quite shocking. Especially since the introduction of austerity measures in many European countries, the use of expressions such as benefit scrounger welfare dependent, and handout, contrasted with hard-working, responsible citizens, are becoming increasingly more common from politicians. By their demeaning and degrading nature, these prejudices against the poor goes directly against the idea of human dignity and the protection that human rights should afford. Moreover, such prejudices are so deeply entrenched that they often inform public policy making, preventing the resulting policies from tackling the systemic factors that prevent persons living in poverty from overcoming their situation. When policies are based on these prejudices, or social protection policies are based in these prejudices, they tend to perpetuate poverty and lay the foundation for human rights violation. I often find this type of prejudices when I discuss with policymakers specific social assistance programs such as conditional cash transfers, unemployment benefit, lone parent benefit, the majority of being women, and even disability benefits. Despite the strong body of evidence to the contrary, I often hear that any social assistance program would be disincentive to work, that the beneficiaries will misuse the money on buying alcohol or other superfluous things, or that they will try to deceive the system. Often their conclusion is that the only way this can be prevented or minimized is by putting in place strict requirements and conditionalities on the poor's receipt of welfare benefit. Such measures often gain political traction as they are implemented alongside rhetoric that suggests that they will ensure that only the deserving poor are receiving support. Such policies are indeed designed as if those living in poverty were the subject of charity instead of right holders, entitled to exercise their rights on an equal basis of the rest of the society. By imposing excessive requirements and conditions on access to services and benefits and severe sanctions for non-compliance, states punish, humiliate, and undermine the autonomy of persons living in poverty, exacerbating the challenges they face in overcoming their situation. As I said, this is happening in developed and in developing countries. In developing countries, although social protection is thankfully increasingly grounded on a widely shared understanding that poverty is multidimensional and persistent in time and across generations, still the idea of reaching only the deserving poor can be found underpinning some of the existing social protection programs. This can be seen, for example, in the placement of conditionalities on eligibility for cash transfer programs or attempt to target certain benefits very narrowly. While it might be easier to gather political support for programs that are perceived to be effective in reaching those in poverty who deserve it, and easier to portray such programs as resource efficient, it is critical that social protection systems fully respect the dignity, the autonomy, and rights of all the recipients and are implemented without discrimination of any kind and provide protection to all those who are most vulnerable and disadvantaged as a matter of priority. To this end, it is essential that choices around a specific policy option for social protection are based not on a narrow political calculations, clientelism, negative stereotypes about the poor, or paternalistic consideration, but rather on a wide understanding of the impact and advantage of the programs after public debate informed by accessible information. I believe that the adoption of a human rights-based approach to policy making systematically across all areas can assist in this task. At the core of the human rights perspective are the idea of universality, equality and non-discrimination, participation, access to information, and accountability. From a rights perspective, there are no undeserving poor. All people are deserving by virtue of being human, and they are entitled to the enjoyment of an adequate standard of living and at least minimum essential level of social protection. Social protection is not a handout or a luxury, but a right that belong to everyone. In order to illustrate further how a human rights approach should be guided or should guide the design and implementation of social protection system, I will focus my remark primarily on the right to equality and non-discrimination between men and women. Social protection systems have the potential to transform gender dynamics. However, to achieve this end, they must be designed taking into account the different type of risk and vulnerability to poverty experienced by men and women. The underlying causes of discrimination against and exclusion of women, and explicitly integrate women's specific needs throughout their life cycle. However, often social protection systems are implemented as if they were gender neutral. Many social protection interventions approach gender equality as a secondary goal. Often, policymakers consider that by making women the beneficiary of social protection programs, all gender concerns are addressed. This is the case, for example, of several conditional cash transfer programs around the world. These programs are mainly targeted to women within the household or female head of household. It is widely understood that targeting women as recipients of social protection benefits significantly improves the education, health, and nutritional level of children. And there is also evidence that suggests that women beneficiaries of conditional cash transfer reportedly feel more empowered. Nonetheless, in order to transform gender relations, avoid perpetuating a stereotypes role of men and women, and challenge the damaging social and cultural pattern with a view to achieving the elimination of all forms of discrimination against women, as is required, for example, by Article 5 of the CEDAW Convention, a state must go beyond simply making women the recipient of social protection benefits. One problem that I often see when assessing social protection programs, such as conditional cash transfer from a human rights perspective, is that they either fail to recognize the role of women as caregiver, or they in fact relied on and increase women unpaid care work. For example, when women are made responsible for complying with conditions attached to receive a social security benefit, for example, taking children to a school or to medical checkup, or when they are required to travel, sometimes long distance, to collect benefits or to participate in various stages of the program, their domestic unpaid workload increases. If this is not expressly addressed in the design of the program, the increased burden on women's shoulders may further undermine their own welfare, entrench their unequal status in the home, and create disincentive to participate in the program. Meeting women beneficiaries of social protection programs in several countries, I often hear from them how the additional demands on their time sometimes hinder their access to formal labor market, limit the possibilities for them to participate in capacity building exercise, including education and training, restrict their ability to seek sexual and reproductive care, particularly if the health centers are not easily accessible and child care is unavailable, and further deprive them of leisure time. Sometimes programs that have not been designed taking into account women's disproportionate responsibility for care work can even have a detrimental impact on girls' schooling, because when a program increases the time that the mother spent outside the household, girls are then sometimes required to assume the mother's activity, such as cooking or collecting water. Therefore, in order to fully maximize the beneficial potential of social protection for women, such programs must be designed taking into account women's unequal burden of unpaid care work. They should seek to reduce and redistribute this work rather than reinforce its gender distribution or intensify it. Additionally, social protection programs must also be designed ensuring that they are accessible to women with care responsibilities by taking into account their constraints such as lack of mobility or limited time. Another serious ramification of failing to ensure women's rights in the design of social protection system is that programs are often not accompanied by accessible, gender-sensitive, culturally appropriate quality public services. Sometimes women may be prevented from claiming entitlements such as education subsidies or free health coverage if the service provided is of bad quality and neglects gender and cultural concerns. For example, indigenous women may be prevented from accessing health care centers that do not provide culturally sensitive care, require them to speak the majority language, or ask for their husband's consent. Girls may not attend school when there are not separate sanitation facilities or when they are harassed by teachers or other students. Some targeting mechanism or eligibility criteria might also have a detrimental impact on women. For example, using household targeting methods can put women at a disadvantage by ignoring the fact that women, in particular older women and girls, often receive fewer resources than men and boys regardless of household income. This is a common problem in non-contributory pension system where often policymakers assess the wealth of the households where an older widow lives but without taking into account the intra-household distribution that may exclude her. Programs must also be designed to mitigate gender power relations and address unequal decision-making powers and roles, both within the households and in the community. The state should ensure that effective participation of women in the administration of social protection programs, for example, by establishing sex quotas and ensuring a gender balance in all participatory events and consultations of the programs. A rights-based approach demands inclusion of participatory channels that are designed to take into account the existing asymmetries of power within the community, eliminate or diminish abuses of power by local elites, and avoid the exclusion of marginalized groups in the participation process, specifically women. Particular attention must be paid to mitigating gender power relations and addressing unequal decision-making powers and roles. This required ensuring women can meaningfully participate both through addressing social and cultural barriers and practical ones, such as by ensuring access to child care by women waiting to participate. From a human rights approach, transparency and access to information is also critical. They are safeguards against corruption, clientelism, and wastage, and represent a vital tool to increase beneficiaries' access to and participation in social protection programs. Limited access to information by beneficiaries impedes their ability to claim their rights and increases the likelihood that their resources allocated to social protection programs will be mismanaged or diverted. In order for social protection programs to comply with human rights standards, therefore, they must be transparent and comprehensively culturally appropriate information must be accessible to all, including the most disadvantaged, for example, those who are illiterate. Transparency must not be limited to the financial management and administration of social protection system. All social protection interventions must have the mechanisms in place to ensure transparency and access to information with respect to all core components of the program, including targeting mechanism, eligibility criteria, benefits level, complaint and redress mechanism. Without this mechanism in place, there is a higher risk that social protection scheme will reinforce and perpetuate unequal power relations, excluding the most in need of assistance. Gender inequality and discrimination patterns greatly affect the equal opportunities of women and men to seek, share, and receive information about social protection programs, participate in decision-making processes, and register complaints, which can result in local authorities being held accountable. Therefore, gender-sensitive mechanisms must be put in place. Let me finalize by saying that in 2007, an author in a paper called Risk, Rights and Needs, Compatible or Contradictory Basis for Social Protection, stated, and I quote, "Advocates of the rights-based approach to social protection need to leave the ivory tower, roll up their sleeve, and contribute ideas on a rights-based design of social protection scheme." While this argument might have had some validity at that time, I believe that is water under the bridge. In recent years, human rights advocates have been actively providing strong and quite concrete guidelines on how using the human rights framework contribute to ensure that the design, implementation, and evaluation of social protection system respect and uphold the rights, the dignity, autonomy, and agency of people living in poverty. While much more needs to be done, it is critical to understand that a rights framework is not only an expression of an aspiration, but rather articulates legally binding obligations that the state policymakers must uphold. Such obligation require the state to ensure that political discourse and policy measures move away from the poisonous paternalistic paradigm of deserving versus undeserving poor and of benefits as handouts or charity to a new vision of all people living in poverty as right holders with entitlements. Given that social protection is a right in itself and it's a key determinant of enjoying of so many other human rights for people living in poverty, the use of a human rights approach in this sphere should not be seen as a matter of semantics or merely the latest fad in development or poverty reduction. The key now is to make politicians, policymakers, the media, and the general public understand that the state has an obligation to provide social protection to all in a manner explicitly aimed at protecting the most disadvantaged from poverty, malnourishment, inadequate housing, avoidable illness, lack of opportunities, and other problems, and ensuring that they can enjoy all their rights on an equal basis with the rest of the population. Thank you very much. I look forward for the debate.
Thank you very much, Magdalena. And I please ask the rest of the panel to come up to the floor. Jimi, Adesina, Christina, Behrendt, and Thomas Hammarberg, please. And what would you like? What would you prefer? One of, please take. You take the chair.
Okay.
Jimi, if you will start.
Okay.
I think that is that's good dynamics. That the panel has been asked to make one statement each in a shorter speech, approximately 5 minutes or so, and after your speeches we'll have a full debate. So I hereby ask you, welcome Jimi, Adesina. You are a professor in social policy and social work from South Africa, and you're also an expert with the UN, and you have been, like other friends here, in the African Institute in Uppsala, and you have published widely in the fields of social policy, social works, and political economy and the development in African states. Is that more or less correct? It's an impressive agenda.
I'm just a teacher, you know.
Please, the floor is yours.
But I don't propose to teach today. Magdalena, it's a pleasure. Let me just say, you know, I feel a lot more comfortable on this panel, which happily actually has a majority of women, because it was beginning to get, I was beginning to get worried yesterday, you know, about the pattern. Let me first say, you know, to thank Magdalene, you know, we agree on most of the issues that you raised. I would like to raise just two areas, and then I will expand this. In question and answer session, we can then go further into this. I'd like to mention something, just go back to something that Thandika Mkandawure said at the opening panel yesterday. And if you look at something here is about learning the right lessons about Sweden. Learning the right lessons about Sweden. The panel in the afternoon yesterday began to worry me considerably. Worried me considerably. And there's a paper that I said will be circulated later, which is published earlier in Canadian Journal of Development Studies, on beyond the social protection paradigm. And it's the social protection dimension that I would like to deal with. Social policy isn't simply about social protection. So let me come to what we call the multitasking, you know, moving beyond the monotasking of social policy. Social policy will have at least 5 what we consider fundamental functions and tasks, as the production, activation, protection, redistribution, reproduction, and nation building. Now, from the context in which I stand, and by the way, if you look at the Swedish, what do you call it, model, not the current Swedish situation. When we talk about Swedish model, we're talking about something that at least was discernible into the what do you call it, early 90s or the mid 90s, is that in fact it simultaneously affected all this. Second thing, social policy architecture is not like going into a supermarket and buying, what do you call it, this particular detergent, that particular soap. It's not a potpourri of assemblage of eclectic ideas. 3, social policy and economic policy cannot pretend to move in opposite direction and then claim to be effective. 4th, and the point that Thandika mentioned yesterday, most of the programs that we mentioned, it was obvious yesterday in Mexico, we saw it with the statistics that was presented about, what do you call it, from the International Security Council. They are marginal to the social policy architecture of many of these countries. Bolsa Familiar, it's 0.34% of GDP. To understand the Brazilian social policy architecture, you've got to go beyond Bolsa Familiar. Oportunidades is marginal to the Mexican framework. What is beginning to be problematic for a number of us is that what is marginal in many of these countries are now made central to how we are supposed to design social policy architecture in the African context. I can come back to this later. But let me try and deal with this in very, very quick steps. Oh my goodness, I thought I had my, okay, so 2 minutes to go. The real innovation of the 1913 pension something, it's universalistic aspiration. The 1913 pension was a change in mindset, but it is not what defined the Swedish model. In terms of things, you have to move to 1948 to begin to think seriously about the Swedish model. What was important is the universalistic, what do you call it? Much of the social protection frameworks and something that is at the moment, as you mentioned, is rooted in a neoliberal mindset of the deserving poor. Some of those targetings were designed to humiliate people. That goes back to the poor law, what do you call it, a framework. 2, we need to understand in terms of the Swedish model, for instance, in terms of the progressive improvement in levels of generosity and diversity of funding mechanisms. It was not simply about obligation on the state. It was also obligations on employers. It was obligations on unions. There were all sorts of networks that are involved in this. People should stop selling one side of the story to us. So when you look at this thing, pension scheme alone does not define the Swedish model. The significance of the Swedish model is in what Joachim Palmer and Walter Koppi refer to as the encompassing social policy. Encompassing. Simultaneous and coordinated multitasking of social policy, what I mentioned earlier on. The coverage was universal, it was generous. Not the stingy one we have now, when households are given 79 cents per person per day, and we're supposed to say, hooray. In a world in which the most egregious definition of poverty puts it at $1.25. I don't know of anybody who can survive on $1.25. It used to be understood as destitution, not poverty. There has been a shifting of the goalpost over the last few years. The most recent Latin American Social Inclusion Index put it at $4. Why do people want to put $1.25 for Africa, and we are supposed to see this as a reduction in poverty? Okay? A loaf of bread and a bottle of water in South Africa will get you above MDG 1. But by August, most of the poor will be dead because they will have died of hypothermia. Well, poverty level will reduce because they will have died of hypothermia. No. Because, and I'll come back to this, Acts of Apostle 4, 32, 33 to 34. Now, in the context of the Swedish model, we were dealing with substantive equality and solidarity. Substantive equality and solidarity. The strong concern was, as it grew, not so much about poverty, it was about inequality. We saw that in the increase in the, what do you call it, tax something in Norway, recently. The concern was not about poverty, it was about rising inequality. You cannot deal with poverty without dealing with inequality. The poor are not a demographic category, a policy category. They are created by social relations that we construct in society. Now, let me end the Swedish dimension of this. It's the transformative nature of Sweden. The social policy was integral to the economic policy, was integral to the gender policy, and if you see, many of you might not have noticed that if you come from some of the more so-called conservative churches, many of the priests you saw, you've seen so far, wearing collars are women. It's not accidental in Sweden. All right? Finally, on this, and I'll just try and rush through this thing. What we require is a return to a broader vision of social policy, the idea of a good society, the idea of a better life for all. It requires that we multitask social policy. It requires that we give it a transformative content, not the one that assuages the minds and the guilt of the rich. Second, social protection is more than just ex post attack of vulnerability. The most effective protection against vulnerabilities is ex ante. It's investment in education, it's investment production activity. Rural poverty is cyclical. What is called farm subsidy, in its impact, Malawi is the most recent example, tends to smoothen consumption and income in farming households. It reduces a situation where they become vulnerable to the kind of humiliating, targeting that we mentioned. And by the way, when 70% of your population is poor, what are you targeting? I mean, give me a break, unless you want to just find work for some army of international gerrymandering characters, what exactly are you targeting? It is time, and this is the plea I would like to make here. I won't have any other opportunity to say this. Can I please beg? It is time to end the social vivisectomy on Africa. We've had 30 years of experimentation. Communities are being damaged in the name of social protection. I can give you detailed village level impact of many of these things. The most recent was Jeffrey Sachs with his Millennium Village. Many of my colleagues who go around Africa, designing pilot projects and things like that, are destroying communities. These communities depend on what you may call norms of reciprocity. The way you do impact assessment with many of these things is you prevent type 1 error and type 2 error, okay? Something called leakage, which means the poor that benefits cannot share with the poor that does not benefit. That is what is happening at the local level in many of these communities. You roll up your programs, and by the time you come, you've destroyed the web of obligation that binds society together. There is a danger with single issue advocacy, because you only see your side of the problem. Policy makers have to see more than just that. It is easier to defend the rights of minorities when you insist on the rights of everybody. The same thing with the question of what it means to be poor. Finally, here, before I ended with this, is that there's a need for us to return to what I would call a locally grounded civil society. The manufacturing of civil societies in Africa, needs to end. The Swedish example, which is many countries will have this kind of thing, are what you may call social movements that are membership-based, and in many cases become training grounds for democracy and how to run things. Trade unions require that. What we have now are NGOs and non-governmental individuals that are non-membership based and are beholden to people outside of the continent. This needs to stop. So it is important for us to return to placing substantive equality and solidarity back at the heart of social policy, thinking and design. It requires going beyond extreme poverty. Yesterday, we understood that in the Swedish context, the social policy architecture arose out of democratic engagement within the countries. What we are having now is an army that is going around imposing a particular singular model on everybody and destroys internal debate within our communities. They subvert the deepening of democracy on my continent. Can I please plead, let this experimentation come to an end. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, Jimi. You have given us all a lot of things to think of and to raise in the following debate. Christina, it's now it's your time. Christina Behrendt, International Labour Organization, and Christina is a doctor in social policy and specialist in International Labour's Office Social Protection Department in Geneva. And you have also an expert in the social policy and working field. So please get on with your speech.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Ulrika, and good morning to everyone. So I think the previous two speakers put the stakes very high, and I would just really kind of continue, or at least try to continue some of the issues and some of the questions that have been raised this morning by Magdalena and Jimi, but also yesterday. I think many issues were raised in the discussion yesterday, and I would like to take up some of them and relate them to, well, one of the recently adopted legal instruments, and the Social Protection Floors recommendation that was adopted in 2012. And I would really like to focus only on 5 points in that regard. but in a way to show or to convince you really to what extent this instrument can actually help to really move these issues and move this debate forward. So basically, this recommendation, I would really like to invite you to read it, and to read it very carefully, because it's written in a legal language that is maybe not that easy to understand, and it's the result of an international discussion and negotiation, not just between governments, between the 185 member states of the ILO, but also with workers and employers. So it might not be very easily accessible in terms of language, but there's a lot of content and there's a lot of substance. And actually, given that this is really an international agreement, it can really be used both at the national level, so really for people to hold their governments accountable to what they have agreed in Geneva, but also at an international level, for example, in the whole discussion on the post-2015 discussion that will be addressed a bit later on today. And this recommendation has been considered as to some really kind of specifying what could be the kind of the minimum core content of the human right to social security. And it also has close relationships to other rights. I'm very grateful to Magdalena to having this already mentioned that in her presentation. It might not be a perfect instrument. I mean, that's hardly impossible to do that. But I think it has a lot of the elements that we have been discussing and that you and Jimi called for this morning. So let me just very quickly go through these 5 points. The first point is that it guarantees basic social security rights as defined at the country level. So, and it's an outcome-based approach that is open to various institutional arrangements. So it is not prescriptive in terms of how these objectives should be obtained, whether they should be through insurance or assistance, to kind of universal benefits, targeted benefits, etc. But it is very detailed and very clear on what the objective should be. And the objective should be to guarantee at least a basic level of social security for everyone. As simple and as complicated as that. And it includes, I would just kind of, as a matter of example, just mention 2 elements of that related to older persons, because we've been discussing a lot about pensions. So for older persons, it says that states should guarantee at least a basic level of income security to older persons that allow life and dignity, among others, and really respect and promote their rights. And it's not about giving cash transfers. It's not about giving contributory pensions. It's about providing them with at least a basic level of income security. And income security is much broader than transfers of income. It is really about the security to plan ahead, the security to live a dignified life and to be empowered. And I shouldn't forget that in addition to the income security, there's another important element, and this is the access to at least essential levels of health care throughout the life course for everyone, which is at least as important as the income security. And it's very clearly kind of linking it also up to the human rights framework by using the categories that were used in the general comment on the right to health, the criteria of availability, accessibility, acceptability, and quality. And this is the language that has been used in the recommendation. My second point is a very strong emphasis on rights and dignity. the respect for the rights and dignity of the people covered by the social security guarantees, and the people covered by the social security guarantees, that basically means everyone. So this is a very strong point which relates to really to a rights-based approach and a human rights-based approach. And in the core of the recommendation, there are actually various elements that try to operationalize this concept. For example, by noting that entitlements should be defined by law, that there should be mechanisms of complaint and appeal that are accessible and free of charge for applicants, just to mention a few. So this is really a way to operationalize that rights-based framework. And also regarding the gender aspects, which are very important and on which both Magdalena and Jimi have made very, very important observations. I mean, we tend to assume that social protection floors should benefit women and girls particularly, but this is not automatic. This is something that really needs to be taken into account in the policy design, in the implementation, but also in the monitoring of national social security systems. But that's, I mean, social security or social protection is not enough. And I think it's very clear also to make these linkages to what's happening and ensuring gender equality in terms of employment, in terms of care, in terms of empowerment. And this is not something which is just about women. I mean, we often hear the kind of the women's care responsibilities, but nobody talks about men's care responsibilities. And I think by using a kind of a more comprehensive approach to these issues, by using whatever can be done in the social security system and the social protection system, but also using other policy areas to really achieve a transformation. I think that's really something very, very important. And I think the Swedish model or the Nordic model really bears witness to the ways of how that can be done and how you can have a combination of transfers and services and a strong also fostering of equality in the labor market, which really helps to achieve that transformation. My third point is about building institutions, about building accountability and building trust. And that relates very strongly to the discussion that we had yesterday about building institutions for the long term that reach beyond the electoral terms of governments, but that stay and that remain really in place and that are effective and efficient and where people trust in the system. And I think this issue of trust is very important, so that people actually trust in the system. And I think in many countries also we have a situation where people basically they don't trust their government. They see corruption, they see inefficiency, and the area of social security or social protection is really one of the areas where there is a really kind of, or there could be a direct interaction between the government and citizens. This is what people see, and they see if things are not happening well. And I think this is also a potential for countries and for governments to really build that trust and be accountable and make sure that people actually have access to those rights and are able to realize their rights. And closely related to that point, my fourth point about participation. I mean, obviously, as this is an ILO instrument, there's a very strong role for employers and workers, but there's also a role for other organizations representing other groups of the population. And I think this is a very strong point that can also be used. And I think it's not yet used to a sufficient degree really at the country level for people really contributing and participating in discussions about how the social security system or how the social protection system are should be developing in order to really reach basically what are the aspirations of the people there, and can help that. And one important point, which is also mentioned in the recommendation, is access to information. And it's not just saying that it's important that people have access to information, but it's also very clear in giving the responsibility, saying that the government actually has a responsibility to inform people about their rights and entitlements. And I think this is also something which is a very important point to make sure that this is really an instrument also of social transformation. And my last point, there is no human right to poverty reduction. And sometimes in the discussion at the international level, we seem to think that there's a human right to poverty reduction, but the human right is a human right to social security, which is much, much broader and which goes much beyond poverty reduction. And that there's a need to tackle access to health, access to income security more broadly and much more comprehensively, and not just as reduction of poverty, but as Jimi said, it's really about preventing poverty, and not just reducing it, not just coming in at the end after people are poor, but it's really about establishing the mechanisms that helps them to prevent falling into poverty. And this is also very closely linked to the discussion on the various inequalities which is currently to be used. So finally, to include, this is an internationally agreed framework. There's a very broad consensus on it. It was agreed by the 185 member states that are part of the International Labour Organization. And it was not just agreed by governments, but also by workers and employers. So it is a very strong and broad consensus. And I would really like to ask you just one thing, use it. And really use it in your discussions at the country level, and use it at your discussions that you're having at the international level. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Christina. And I remind you all of the fact that after the conference, all written speeches, all written material will be available on the conference homepage. So everything will be documented, available, and hopefully used in the future. Thank you very much, Christina. And then Thomas Hammarberg, who is senior human rights expert, and since many years, and after starting off as the chairman of Amnesty in Sweden, has devoted his life and his time to these questions for several years. So thank you, and the floor is yours, Thomas. Blir den grön?
No work, so. As has already been illustrated here, poverty is very much linked to inequalities. And inequalities, of course, are related to injustices. And injustices are, of course, a reflection of bad implementation of human rights. The discussion about the situation of elderly people is very much a question of human rights. I was for some years Commissioner for Human Rights in the Council of Europe and traveled very much in the European areas. And what I saw there illustrated how acute the situation for elderly people have become in Europe today. And most of the victims of the human rights violations or discrimination against elderly people are targeting, in reality, women. And if you travel today in the, not least in the Eastern European countries, in Kiev, Moscow, Tbilisi, Baku, etc., you see women, elderly women, sitting in the pavements and begging. They're begging. They were, in the former communist countries, first the victim of the changes which took place in the late 1980s, early 1990s. They had pensions, most of them, but very little. Very little because they had rather few years as employed, because they've had to take care of children or elderly people in their homes, and therefore had very few points which would put them on a reasonable level when it comes to the pension rate. And now, with the introduction of a market economy in those countries, the pension rate was just too low for them to survive, and they were forced out in the streets just to beg. The austerity programs in the whole of Europe, which have been introduced in the last 4 or 5 years, have also had a very negative impact on the elderly generation in our countries. There have been cuts in the budgets when it comes to the pensions, to the other allowances, and not least to the staff in the institutions where elderly people live. And there have also been cuts in the, which is very important in fact and forgotten in the debate, cuts in the contributions from the budgets to the monitoring bodies. The ombudsmen and similar bodies which had the task to monitor the situation for groups of people in the country, they got less resources in order to receive complaints and act upon complaints and to issue reports. And this has been a great problem, in my opinion, when it comes to respect for human rights, also in the more affluent European countries. To my opinion, this is very much a question of attitudes. The attitudes which are still there, that elderly people are not very useful in society, and that they are a burden on the budget, and the more elderly people we get in our societies, the more burden on the budget in a situation when there is an economic problem all over the society. And the elderly have suffered from this. In many cases, irresponsible privatization of services for the elderly have also had a bad effect on the situation for many elderly people in Europe today. I mentioned that the ombudsman and similar bodies there to monitor the respect for human rights has been under-resourced recently in many European countries. There was one very important report published, though, by the health ombudsman in England a couple of years ago, and he focused very much on the changes of attitudes, not least in the institutions for elderly people, saying that there were nowadays, because of the pressure on the staff and the reduction of the number of staff, a growing problem of insensitivity to the needs of the elderly people, and thereby also a lack of professionalism. And this unfortunately did not, this important report unfortunately did not cause much discussion in the United Kingdom. It's a question of attitudes. A good example in Europe and a very promising experiment was when in Ireland they founded a non-governmental structure composed of several non-governmental organizations. And they call themselves Older and Bolder. And they started a campaign in Ireland, in the Republic of Ireland, for another view on elderly people and their situation, emphasizing it's not only a question of financial means for the elderly, though that was important, but also have another approach to their lives in general, their possibilities to participate in the society for those who wanted to work longer than the entrance of the pension age. They should have the right, and the right to continue to work in their workplaces. And of course, they had a number of suggestions also, and have still, on how the life in those institutions where the elderly people are, the old people are, in order to make their lives more decent. And that's a good example of the possible contribution that non-governmental organizations could give. And I recommend people to look into their website, a fascinating, inspiring website, in fact. Human rights are defended, or should be defended at least, by international treaties, and we heard here about the new ILO contribution to that effect. Those who have studied the United Nations in general when it comes to the protection of human rights, we have found that there isn't much actually in the United Nations treaties and when it comes to institutions within the United Nations. We have nothing like UNICEF when it comes to the protection of elderly people within the UN structure. And in fact, the work being done by the key human rights treaties, the committee defending the rights, the civil and political rights, and that covenant, or the one on economic, social, and cultural rights, which was mentioned here, they haven't focused much on the rights of the elderly, in spite of the fact that almost every human rights convention starts with everyone has a right to, etc. Everyone has a right. And of course that should include also the elderly people. So there is a need to push further when it comes to securing that within the established human rights mechanisms there is a better protection for the elderly people and a better understanding of the various needs which also elderly people have. Within Europe we have a system where civil and political rights are dealt with in the European Convention on Human Rights with the court in Strasbourg, the European Court for Human Rights. And we have a separate structure and treaty when it comes to the social economic rights with the social charter or revised social charter in the Council of Europe and the committee monitoring the implementation of that right. The unfortunate result of this is that there is a sort of grading of the rights, and the most important rights, it's seen to be those who are dealt with within the European Court of Human Rights. And that's unfortunate. This divide was, of course, a result of the Cold War tensions we had the years after the Second World War. There is an attempt to try to at least partly address this problem by the adoption of a special protocol to the European Convention on Human Rights, a protocol against discrimination. If that protocol was ratified by member states, it would make it possible to bring also to the European Court of Human Rights issues of discrimination against elderly people. But this protocol has not been ratified by the majority of the member states, and one which has not ratified it is this country, Sweden. Finland has, Netherlands did, but Sweden has abstained from doing that, and saying that we don't know the consequences of ratifying it, and thereby that this protocol would enter into force. How would the court deal with these issues coming when it comes to discrimination? I think there is a need to discuss in more depth why Sweden abstains from giving that contribution to a more structured and effective, in my opinion, position against discrimination, which would certainly cover also discrimination of the elderly people and be one contribution against the atmosphere of ageism that we actually have in our society today. Thank you.
Thank you. Considering the demographic situation in Europe, your visions are alarming, Thomas. Thank you still. I think due to the shortage of time, I see at least two prevailing themes here in your speeches. And Jimi put it like this: you cannot talk about poverty without speaking of inequality. And the other is, you cannot talk of poverty without thinking of human rights. And these themes coincide, cooperate, and sometimes maybe contradict each other. But I choose to leave the word to the floor for the last few minutes. So please. Well, now this is surprising. Do I see? Does anyone have a question? Erik?
You were talking about the two themes, Ulrika, and I think we can perhaps come back to that from other questioners. But because I have a specific question to Magdalena from your speech, where you say that social protection schemes can transform gender dynamics if they are designed in the correct way. And then you were showing some of the deficiencies that you have identified in current protection schemes. But do you have any good example of where you think this has been taken on board in the different schemes that you have seen around the world, where you sort of take account of the unpaid care work of women, for instance, or they have designed in such other ways that it also implies gender empowerment and so forth? So just a comment from you.
I would like to appreciate all the speakers. There's a lot of clarity, a lot of an in-depth reflection is kindled, and I want to thank these four speakers. One thing that I would like to ask any of you to respond with regard to the issues that you raised, for example, lack of gender sensitivity when you speak about human rights, or just like what Jimi said about lack of local understanding. When you speak about the human rights, you cannot pass human rights to everybody in the same level. What is lacking? How do we create this social consciousness in the society? Whether it's developed society or developing society, what is missing is the social sensitivity, or the sensitivity to the oppressed and the marginalized. If that doesn't come in the priorities, under the priority, top priority, we will miss the human rights perspective. It's not just application of human rights, but rather the creation of human rights perspective in our life. One may be to create it with the childhood, that is in the children. That's just one example, but I would like to get response from the speakers. How do we create the social consciousness in the society, whether it's developing countries or developed countries? That will go for a lasting solution to this issue of lack of human rights perspective in our social approach.
Thank you very much. But please, Magdalena, if you take up the question from Erik. No, I think we start off and then go, because now we have two. I think we take those two questions first. Yes, please, Magdalena.
Thank you for the question. I do believe that there are some social protection systems that have been good, are incorporating.
Please put it on.
As incorporating sort of gender issues and trying to transform gender dynamics. There are some programs, for example, that take into account the need of having childcare facilities for women. You have some public work programs that they do, and you have some cash transfer that they do take this into account. So there is this possibility for women that would like to participate. There is other programs in which all the interactions that the beneficiaries of the program have to take with the system, with the program, are used in a way of raising awareness of important issues at the local level. Child marriage, violence against women, etc., with men and women. And they try to use sort of the opportunities of the program, the opportunities that the programs provide in order to challenge gender stereotype roles. So I think that this is very good and it's possible to do. My main concern is that this cannot be done ex post facto. You cannot try to incorporate a gender, I mean, you should, but I mean, ideally this should be in the design of the program, and it should be in all the stages of the program. So in the design, in the implementation, but also the evaluation of the program should have gender-oriented questions in order to gather the voice of women. So there are some programs, there are some good lessons to learn, but this has to be done systematically from the very beginning.
Thank you. And what about this more philosophical question of how do we create a social conscience in developed and developing countries as well, Thomas?
I don't think it is a philosophical question. I think it's a very concrete challenge. One problem we have is that the human rights discourse tries to be above party politics and politics. We want everyone to be behind the standards, and therefore we are not presenting them as political. But of course all the issues we're discussing are very much rooted into politics and ideology. And the austerity program in Europe today, of course, is driven by a certain ideology. And we don't want to take that debate because we are afraid of undermining the consensus behind our message, the human rights message. So it is a real dilemma. Maybe we have chosen the right approach as we have, but we have to recognize it is a problem. And I see the only sort of medicine here, only possibility is active civil society movements. I mean, they are the ones who could produce a change. They are not perfect. They are problems, so we should be critical, etc. But the kind of changes we have seen has very often been the civil society input and what they have done. Not only what they have done concretely, I mean the charity approach, but also the message they have sent to the politicians. And in some countries we see today that very active human rights people are actually coming into politics. And in the country I've worked quite a bit on now, in Georgia, the civil society activists who have knowledge and experience and contact with the real problem, they have been sucked into politics, and that has had a positive impact. So that's the only message I can give on this perhaps not so philosophical question.
No, I agree.
No, I mean, let me talk from the what you may call the perspective. I think. Oh, okay. Help me out. All right, thank you very much.
There you are.
You know, sometimes I think we can raise these issues in a way in which they makes them look esoteric. Let me tell you the starting point. It's the context in which I was born, the context in which I grew up, and the context in which I was born. It's okay. I'll hold it here. You hear in Southern Africa and South Africa, but those used loosely, something called the norms of Ubuntu. It's not specific to Africa, okay? I mentioned the norms of reciprocity and the concept of solidarity. Indeed, when we talk about resilience among the poor, it's often a function of the dynamics of these norms of reciprocity. But what does that actually mean? Ubuntu. It means I see myself in you. When a woman is raped, it's not a woman who is raped. It's a part of me. It's my daughter, it's my child. I may not know the person. When I see a child on the street begging, that's not a child on the street. That's my child on the street. And if there's a lesson, and you're right, I mean, part of what is masquerading these days as public policy is grounded in a very individualistic, environment. If you look at the debates around the prominence of poverty and essentially disguising inequality, it was in the context of what is called the roaring 80s, the decade of greed. So that I can afford to buy a Lamborghini, which doesn't tell me that the person who buys is a very intelligent person. You have a vehicle that says can go at 350 something kilometers per hour in a country where the maximum speed limit is 110. So the person selling you that vehicle doesn't think you're a very smart person. And in most towns, probably speed limit of 60. He doesn't even have a boot. So it can't be that you're traveling between cities, that's the reason why you buy it. So what is the point? In many countries, many of our countries, you have this excessive, gratuitous consumption behavior in an environment of unbelievable, what do you call it, deprivation. I mean, Cape Town is a classical example. You may hear that Cape Town is a beautiful place and this and that, but please, next time you're in Cape Town, walk away from the waterfront, move into Kailicha and all those areas, and ask yourself, how is it that we can even tolerate this too? Let me end on this. There's the old story that there is enough for everybody's need, but not for everybody's greed. For me, that's a more practical approach to many of these issues. It's not a philosophical issue, it's an existential one. And my chances of survival in many of these communities narrow because, I drive in my expensive car in an environment where people face really humiliating existence. And then somebody sticks a gun in my face, and it doesn't occur to me that I'm not dealing with just crime. I'm dealing with anger. So the question I had, and this is end. I asked many of my colleagues in South Africa, why is it that Norwegian medical students have to come to Baragwana Hospital in Johannesburg to know what a gunshot wound looks like? What is it that Norway did about its own country? Can't tell now, but going forward. That makes gunshot wounds so rare.
Christina would like to answer.
Christina, and then please, Annette, give, who has the microphone?
Ulrika also would like to add to this one.
I think a lot has already been said on the question of how to create that social consciousness in a society. And I think just adding to what was already said, I think it's the issue is not that it's not there. The issue is that it is there in people's communities, it's there in the families. So it's there in kind of the smaller units of society, where you find a lot of solidarity, where you find a lot of help between people. But it's not reaching beyond that, and it always remains a question of we and them. I mean, the poor help themselves, or they help each other, but it doesn't reach beyond them. And the rich, in a way, have also their kind of mechanisms of mutual assistance, but it's not going beyond that. And I think, thinking about a human rights framework, you have to take the picture much more broadly. You have to think about societies, you have to think about nations, and ultimately you have to think about the global society. And And this is not possible, and this debate has not really been led yet, although, I mean, we're discussing much more about inequality now, but there's little discussion about redistribution, and I mean, you had that on your first slide. And the question is, because, I mean, implementing a working and operational human rights framework is not possible without having efficient and effective and equitable mechanisms of redistribution, and in a kind of a broader scale to allow for that, for these kind of solidarity mechanisms. And this is, again, really about building institutions. And yeah, maybe I'll stop at that point.
Magdalena?
I would also like to add to what it has been said. I think that one of the main problems is that people living in poverty do not have a voice politically. They don't have the time to participate in the cultural, economic, and social life in the society. And this is because of the scarcity, the problems that they face, and the obstacles that they face that it's imposed by poverty. And I think that there is a lot of that public policies can do in order to open up the space. If we take the issue of women, for example, it is very difficult to find women organizing and women's groups to organize and tackle if the issue of unpaid care work is not recognized and redistributed, and is not taken as a problem by the society as a whole, and the state assume a role in solving this problem. Just one example. There has also happened that some minorities, for example, the lack of participation of Roma in Europe, or the lack of political participation of indigenous groups, for example, in Latin America. So there's a lot to do that social protection system or social policies can do in order to open up the participatory space by also giving them the time. I think it is quite interesting what we are seeing now, for example, in Brazil, in which some of the new social unrest has been explained by some authors, some commentators, as being the result of this middle classes. There are these new middle classes, those who have who are no longer living in poverty and now are able to express themselves politically. And I think that that is very crucial, it's very telling. If they were living in poverty, they do not have the time. But public policies, social protection system can play a role in allowing people living in poverty to participate, to be part of the society, not only in the political realm, but also cultural and socially.
Thank you. You have the microphone over there, and I must ask you now, because I'm a bit in distress, really. We have had, well, we've taken 15 minutes of the coffee break already, and I think that is okay, because we needed this debate. But I ask you now, do we really need 15 minutes more just now, or can we have your speech as the last one? No? Well, you get 1 minute each then, 3 person, okay?
All right.
And you start.
Thank you. I just want to add a few more things. It's really good to finally hear the gender dimension in this conference. And few more things I would like to just add from a gender perspective that is important when we talk about social security, social protection, both in terms of definition as well as in terms of design. Firstly, when we look at social security, even talking from universality of social security, dominant discourse around social security comes as a workers' rights, whereas women are not seen as workers in general, they are seen as dependent on male breadwinners. And so, however, most women work in paid, unpaid, at home, outside home, in productive work, in reproductive work, in care economy. And therefore, how we define work is at the heart of how we define social security and talking about entitlement. Second, what Magdalena talked about, how we move from deserving poor to right holder. In delivery, most of the time, particularly from developing countries, benefits, entitlements of social assistance, social security go to family as a unit. And women get social security not as an individual right holder, but as a member of a family or as a dependent on a male breadwinner. This, from a human rights perspective, is a huge issue. We need to look at it as women, as individual right holder, as how they get benefits and how they get entitlements.
Definitely. Thank you. Okay. And I'm sorry, we have three speakers here, and we have one from Help Age. Where do we have the Help? Yes, and that's it. And I definitely put a roof on this session, but you will be welcome on the next one, I'm sure, because we must. I see that the questions raised here under this seminar will, of course, not lose their common interest in the next seminar. Okay?
Well, I'm Luise Stemmers from Bread for the World in Germany. I have a question to Professor Adesina. Actually, I was very moved by your presentation, and especially when you said, let's please stop all these piloting. Recently, I've heard about Zambia having had, I don't know how many millions of pilots, conducted in Zambia. Now, to my view, I think what is really a big or many actors in that whole field are the international development cooperation agencies, and actually I think they are kind of, even you could talk about an international competition, having the best experiences, evidences, who is better, DFID or GIZ or whoever. So I would like to ask Professor Adesina, how do you see the activities of the international development agencies or donors in that whole, game of social protection? Thank you.
A follow-up question, also to Jimi Adesina. Could you identify those African or developing countries with a stronger political agency that would challenge those kind of piloting? And then the question, or I think it relates to my question from yesterday, what are the constraining frameworks at a global level? Social development is supposed, or social policy is an area of a competence of national policy. Economic and trade policies are increasingly made at regional level or international level. So the question again, where and how is the discussion happening between social and economic policy for them to join hands rather than to compensate the one for the other? And do you have examples within Africa or within developing countries where that is starting to take shape, that kind of discussion or coming together of economic and social policies? Thanks.
And
hi, thank you. Help Age International. Very recently in the Human Rights Council, a resolution was adopted to establish a UN independent expert on the rights of older people. I just wanted to ask Magdalena Sepúlveda and Thomas Hammarberg if you could comment on what impact you think that development would have on some of the specific challenges that you outlined in your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you all. Then, Jimi, if you would, can you sum up the questions, and then we'll give the word to Magdalena and Thomas.
Okay. Well, okay, look, this is all, it's often very easy to misunderstand. Mike? Okay, all right. First of all, there are two ways in which one can look at what we call donor, okay? Much in the same way that you have principles of solidarity at community level, at national level, at regional level, you also have the principle of solidarity at international level. Okay? And there is no better country to demonstrate it than Sweden. My own experience over the last 30 years, about 5 years before then, the experience you get in interaction with colleagues from Sweden is not the same thing you get when you're interacting with colleagues from North America or Britain or France. It's true. It used to be in the 60s that you depended on the agency of people in the so-called developing countries. Now we have a whole army of young people running all over the world wanting to save the world with very little understanding of national dynamics, local dynamics, and things like that. So let's separate the issue of international solidarity, which is important. Okay? And then separate that from the point that this is the elephant that is hiding in the room. That what we're dealing with have been fundamental ideological transformation. Neoliberalism is dead, long live neoliberalism. Much of what we're dealing with is in fact a consequence of this, and it's an ideological battle. A dimension of social protection is driven by a neoliberal mindset, and the content is neoliberal. Okay, it's rooted in the poor law. Okay, it assumes at an ontological level that individuals are economic agents. Okay, all right. So I think it's important to recognize. So let me come to the particular examples, and I think there are other colleagues here later in the session on targeting and universalism that can go into this in a bit more detail. Just so that there's a corroboration. I'm not going to use my own personal experience or what I know. Just so that there's corroboration. We were discussing yesterday, and somebody was telling me this example of a woman in Kalomo collected the money and was running, had the money to say, and then they followed her to her house and said, look, said, oh, no, my neighbors hate me now, because I can't, this thing. You can't share this thing because that's part of the requirement. You can't share, Now, we know with the Kalomo project, for instance, there's only a fraction of the food poor that actually covered. But it raises issues of humanity. You do and there's a lot of experiments now. Laboratory type experiment, control groups, what do you call it, experimental groups. So in one particular group in Malawi, you give them textbooks and this and that. Then in the next, village, you don't give. And then the students came back to LSE and were complaining, sorry, forget about the name of the institution, came back and were complaining that the government messed up the experiment. How did the government make the experiment? Because the people in the next village complained about not getting the thing and the government supplied them. So they ruined the experiment. Now, I used to think that there was something about do no harm as an ethical foundation. Now, when you're in a community that is 80% poor, what targeting are you doing? The examples in Kenya, all over the place. One of the paper that I will distribute later, some of the evidence that people are given is a 15% increase in chicken ownership. Now, I ask the question, suppose there is no 15% increase in chicken ownership, will these people be less deserving? Okay? People who are old have spent their lifetime working and contributing to society. It is not a question of something, it's about collective obligation to them to protect them in their old age. That is not favor that you're doing them. 20 years earlier, they were the ones who sustained the economy. That's the foundation in which we begin to look at many of these issues. But then the question about, for instance, what is the nature of this debate? We've had over the last few years on the African continent what has been very, let me use the word, very interesting discussions. Okay? And that's why I'm appealing to many of my colleagues. Some of them are here, some of them are not here. Let's stop this experiment. These are human beings, they're not guinea pigs. Even guinea pigs, there's something unethical about trying to test lipsticks and using monkeys. Okay? Monkeys don't need lipsticks. And you can live without lipsticks. It's unethical to do some of those things. It's even more unethical to do it with human beings. But there's a whole debate. I mean, 2 weeks ago, I came back from Dakar. This is the third group. It's a 2-week training program on social policy in development context. Okay? And we insist on not training one social policy analyst that you put in Ministry of Finance. We insist on a whole transformation of thinking. Okay?
Can you please?
Yes. All right. And so if is a debate going on? Yes, it is. But this is an international platform. This is the context of the church. I would also like to end it here by, if you have your Bible with you, if you don't, go back and read Acts of Apostles 4:34 to 35. for there was not a needy one among them. For all those who had sold what they had and gave and brought the proceeds to the feet of the apostles. We're not asking, this is not Communist Manifesto. This is the way the first church emerged. That is the concept of solidarity.
Yes, Magdalena, can you please take up?
Yes, you're going to kill me, Ulrika, but I would like to add 3 words on what Jimi has said. I think that I fully agree with him, the duty to do no harm, but I also think that we have to hold donors more accountable of what they're doing. They have to ensure ownership of their policies. They have to improve coordination and more harmonization of their policies. And I think that it's also very important that any social protection system that it has ownership and there is some at least some commitments from the country that they're going to start providing progressively money from their own pockets to build. But the program should be established in with a correct legal and institutional framework in order to prevent that this type of pilot might be one day there, next day they are not there, and then this might provoke more damage to the people. That's all. In terms of the question, very briefly.
Maybe you can give that question to Thomas.
Perfect.
No, you have it already. Okay, you get another chance. I'm sorry.
No, 3 words. I welcome very much the fact that there is going to be a new special procedures for the rights of older person. I think that it has the potential to have a lot of impact in mainstreaming the issue of the rights of older person within the whole UN system. But the main point will be to support the mandate holder. There is, and this is a very practical concern that I think it is crucial. There's been a cut of funds from the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights that provide the Secretariat for all mandate holders that might infringe the capacity of future mandate holders to exercise their rights as they would like to. So I call on the help page, and that I know that it will be there, but also to other organizations to provide a lot of support to the mandate holder, and also to ensure that the election of the person is going to comply with the requirements, in particular that is going to be independent, in particular from governments. That's all.
Thank you very much, Magdalena, Jimi, Christina, and Thomas.